Okay, so you guys have looked a little bit at Shibboleth. You're familiar. So you know it's at the Tate Modern in their giant turbine hall. We have two works we're going to look at today that are in turbine hall. And did we look at one last time? No, that was my other group of students. So it's this huge industrial space that has been sort of retrofitted as a gallery meant to display really large-scale works made for the space. So Salcedo is a Colombian artist whose career began in the 1980s. She studied, like many of the artists that we're looking at that are sort of categorized as global, she studied in the United States. She went to NYU for her MFA. And when she came home from NYU in the mid-1980s, she came home to a situation of extreme violence, political violence. There were between 85 and 95, nearly 20,000 people in Colombia disappeared. So much of the violence that she's dealing with in her work is not explicit. It's not violence that she sees happening. It's just people who vanish, right? So there's a sense of not only a lack of knowledge of what happened to people, but any way to sort of fulfill mourning or complete the mourning process. So witnessing that form of brutality and violence and its broader social effects, she felt compelled to find a way to represent the experiences of her fellow citizens in a way that didn't just make a picture of it, but instead sought to represent that emptiness, the absence of evidence, of people, of knowledge. She wrote that she began to conceive of works based on nothing, in the sense of having nothing and there being nothing. So this is one of the first works that she did addressing the current events, the sort of recent history and current events that concerned her. She began to visit and interview the families of people who had disappeared. They were mostly women that she met, and their homes, she said, were marked by the absences of fathers, of sons, of brothers, of husbands. And she felt when she was in their homes, she was most able to sort of get a sense, a handle, a material handle on this loss, which was a blank. And she said she began to collect materials from their homes. People would give her things, furniture, items of clothing that she could work with. So she didn't want to make new things at this point. She wanted to work with pre-existing materials. So this is a work where she has cut holes into the wall of the gallery. Inside these recesses, she places shoes, and then they're covered with sheets of pig bladder that are stitched into the wall. So here you can, these images give you a better sense. Sorry?
They're shoe-sized?
Yeah, they're actual shoes. Okay. Yeah, those are just real shoes collected from people's homes. And I mean, one of the sort of poetic connections offered by shoes in this case is that often, in the few cases when there was any real information, occasionally mass graves would be found. And when they were found, the bodies would often be so badly decomposed that you couldn't identify people, but family members would be able to say, oh, I know those shoes. So shoes were connected to the body in a very intimate way, and they spoke of that sense of loss. There's also the European history of the collections of shoes during the Holocaust, that sense of collections of shoes speaking to loss, and a kind of anonymous loss. So from here, she went on to these furniture projects, and initially she worked, again, with furniture from people's homes. But increasingly, she has a workshop where she has a huge team of people building these pieces of furniture, aging them, filling them with concrete, placing new pieces, other pieces of furniture inside, as we see here, or crumpled up clothing. And she's spoken of the effort that goes into making these and the result, which is a sort of blank concrete box, something you can't do anything with, something useless. And she's spoken about this sense of spending enormous amounts of money on making something, or sorry, not money, time and effort, spending enormous amounts of time and effort making something useless to her speaks to that sort of wasteful loss of human life within her context under regimes of violence. She speaks of herself as a sort of secondary witness in these cases. Again, she says the people that she meets with are generally not in a position to act on their losses. To do so would be dangerous, even if they had the cultural capital to present their voice in a public or legal way. So she goes in, she interviews them, and then she takes their stories out into the world in these very abstracted poetic forms. So then to Shibboleth. So what does that word mean? Anybody, what is a...
Does it mean like a rent or a break or something, or is that not?
Not exactly, no. I mean, we could get it there through sort of extreme mental calisthenics, but... Yeah.
Designator that I'm part of a group or not.
Yes. Yeah, this sense, it's how you prove that you belong to a particular group. And if you don't have it, if you can't say that word correctly, if you don't know the code, then you're excluded. So she spoke about entering the turbine hall. And when she was invited to do this work, and she said it seemed incredibly arrogant, this space. Here we can see a larger view. She said that she found this sort of odd reaction that people had to the space, that art viewers had to the space, to be absurd and narcissistic. I'm curious about what you guys think of that. How could being amazed by a space be narcissistic or absurd? That's sort of...
There's nothing actually there.
There's nothing there. And she's like, it's an industrial space, right? It just is... Yeah, it was useful, and then it stopped being useful, and then we emptied it out and made it useful in a different way. And she wanted to sort of lower the space in some way, to reduce that sense of self-importance and pride. So she creates this crack. Any thoughts on how, since today's focus is meant to be like medium and material, how exactly does one create work like that?
A jackhammer? Like, I don't know.
One would think, but it actually, like they built, the whole thing was very carefully constructed. Like she built these walls that sort of fit into one another and essentially built up the floor. Professor Gonzalez, who did this last year and I guess gave a talk on this piece, which is one of the reasons I'm being quick with it, she said that she couldn't find it. She went looking for it. And the sort of scar of it in the floor, and I believe it wasn't there because it just, that part of the floor is gone. They're back to their standard floor. But so what is this about? I mean, here's the question that we have to struggle with. We can talk about how it's this very carefully constructed object that just looks like a flaw, but why make it? Why create this empty space? Yeah, people are here.
Yay, I'm so sorry you've already started.
Yeah. She's spoken about this work as being about, so again, this idea of the shibboleth, of the idea of belonging or not belonging. She said she was thinking about immigrant populations, immigration, and refugees when she made this. So, I mean, this is a work, it was 2007, 2008, almost a decade ago. But today, although it doesn't exist anymore, I think it has a particular resonance. And I'm sure that your students are aware of current events in a way that this could be an interesting thing for them to think about. How could this be about immigration? How do we read it this way? How can we find in this very simple, apparently simple object?
The space is divided, and we're talking about people who are trying to find a place to belong.
So the sense of a split or division. We have a material that is consistent across the floor, and yet it is fragmented, it's fractured, it's lost its cohesiveness. So this sense of a sort of social contract that has failed in some way. And again, particularly today, this may be a little bit literal, but the sense of people who fall between the cracks, who disappear on a global level. So she begins her career with an interest in the disappeared in Colombia, and here she's engaging more with a sort of global population of people who disappear, people who have no safe homeland, people who are politically disenfranchised. And this is an enormous population, right? I mean, the privilege of citizenship is quite extraordinary. We treat it here as if it's a right. But for many people, it's not an accessible right. So instead of telling a story about immigrants, about refugees, about being seen as different, being excluded, about not speaking the language adequately, she's looking for a way to tell this story that isn't literal, that's poetic. Are you guys familiar with this? It's pulled out a lot. Theodor Adorno, who's a member of the Frankfurt School, who moved from Germany to Los Angeles during World War II, he came as a refugee. And there's this famous quote, "There can be no poetry after Auschwitz." Is that familiar to people? And it sort of gets thrown out a lot as, oh, we just can't have art anymore after Auschwitz. After something that awful, there can't be any more art. And that's not what he meant, of course. But there is this sense that traditional modes of representation and storytelling simply don't apply. They don't work when the tragedy is so great that to try to turn it into a relatable story is to minimize it in ways that are doubly tragic. So she's an artist who's looking for ways, like with her shoes and the holes in the walls, or these pieces of furniture that have been filled with concrete, these no longer useful, now incredibly heavy, hard objects. She's looking for ways to articulate the feeling of loss, of separation, of, in some cases, emptiness, and in others, dislocation, without relying on those words, instead of giving people this sense of a world that is cracked, right, that's broken. Questions about Salcedo? Yeah.
Just because we walked in late, I'm so sorry to ask questions because you probably already know all
Here,
of this.
I'll rush through the.
I'm just wondering if, I actually saw an exhibit like this that was by Kiki Smith.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But beyond that,
Yeah.
is Shibboleth an installation? So it's only in a museum?
And it's gone. It was a temporary installation. It doesn't exist anymore.
Isn't it? There's nowhere you can see it now,
No.
and it will never be put up again, as far as or may.
I mean, she could rebuild it or make a similar piece, but as is the case with many of the Turbine Hall pieces, the projects that go in this space, it's simply gone.
And is that line, the black line, is it illusion that you actually could fall down through it?
It's an actual crack, yes. Although, as we talked about, she didn't how would you do this? Would you take a jackhammer to the floor? But in fact, she built walls with these and a new floor, basically. So,
Those high heels could slip down. And a woman could break
absolutely,
their shoe.
yes. And there are places where, here, you could fit a foot in there. You could break your ankle, absolutely. Yes.
So, did she ever articulate in the sense that, so she went in knowing that this installation was going to disappear?
Oh, absolutely, yes, definitely.
So that even the very nature of her media is a reinforcement of her idea, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great observation. So these works are works that they circulate. They're things, they're objects in the world, but this installation, this was temporary. Again, it was she cut holes in a wall, put the shoes in, sewed over the pig's bladders, and then when the show was over, they came down. Yeah.
The names, like this one's Satra Bellario, I don't know what that means.
Defiant. Defiant. Yes.
Shibboleth is I almost could define that, but not quite.
Yes, so Shibboleth, you did a great job of defining it earlier. Do you want to?
You did a better job, but basically it's a way of proving you belong to a group, showing the code words or the right things to fit in.
Yes. So today, I mean, we contemporary shibboleths would be things like, say, for a young person who has immigrated to the United States, for instance, do they understand fashion codes? Do they have an accent? Are they familiar with popular culture? So this sense that people can identify you as different, as not belonging, which is an experience that anyone can have if they wander into a situation that is unfamiliar, where they don't belong. But I think we see it in particular today in immigrant and refugee communities. Yeah. No, I did. So this was one of her earliest works about the violencia in Colombia, the disappearances. And we did talk about the fact that there is sort of a connection. We read it through the Holocaust, but also when mass graves were dug up in Colombia, people were often identified by their footwear.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much. I'm
sure.
sorry, everyone, for asking. You'd already covered it. Was this at the tape? That was my last one.
Yes, that was in the turbine hall.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know what turbine hall is.
It's this giant, it's a relatively new space. It's this huge industrial space that had turbines in it. You can look it up online if you do a search for turbine hall pictures. You can find these really grotty old machines before they took them out and turned it into this beautiful exhibition space. Again, specifically really geared towards installation work like this. I know there have been, Louise Bourgeois had an exhibition, so they were sculptures brought in, but most of the installations I've seen here only exist while they're in here. Olafur Eliasson had a really great project with mirrors on the ceiling and this crazy light and smoke machines, and we'll look at the Ai Weiwei.